Management and leadership skills that are applicable to systems engineering. Basically, you can think about it in two different levels. There's two different levels of leadership and management responsibility. There's the overall project lead, or referred to as like the chief systems engineer. And then there's a series of functional leaders that are responsible for individual disciplines, different specific functions. So to summarize again, there's somebody that's responsible for overall, all the activity. And then you have experts in different areas, like someone who's going to worry about the architecture diagrams and how the thing is going to functionally behave, behaviors, and how information is going to flow from one point to another. You'll have an expert that's going to worry about testing and thinking about things, how the drawings are coming along and how the requirements sound, and how they're going to test them off eventually. The chief engineer is responsible to keep tabs on all this activity and always try to stay one step ahead of the team, so that they can be on point when it comes to understanding progress, understanding where issues are coming up, those kinds of things. So that's the first piece to understand about systems engineering, and that's kind of analogous to a lot of different complex projects. You're usually going to have, a single person in charge, and then a series of experts in different areas. But in systems engineering, it becomes more important to have strong leadership, because when you get into the details of trying to design a complex system and actually develop it, those roles, really get involved in the following ways. So let's talk first about like the chief engineer's perspective on design and development. So during the design phase, when you're first trying to understand what the customer needs, whether it be a Humvee that's got to be better armored to deal with improvised explosive, really getting a good handle on understanding what the need is at the front end is a challenge that a lot of programs face. A lot of these complex systems fail. I wouldn't say outright fail, but they struggle to get a good handle on understanding what really that customer needs up front, and then doing a good job of that initial exercise of trying to break into pieces what it's going to take to put that Humvee together with the right weight, with the right reinforcement, so that it can still be efficient and move quickly, but yet still be protective of the passengers. So the chief engineer is responsible to make sure that they spend just enough time to gain enough confidence that they have a good handle on those requirements for that system, for that product they're going to build. The functionals are usually involved at that front end of the design process because they need to contribute. They need to bring their expertise from their different perspectives to help the team ultimately make sure they have a good set of requirements on how that vehicle needs to function, how that vehicle needs to behave when you're riding in it, how it needs to be measured, and how it needs to perform. All those kinds of things that require a full team. But again, the chief is responsible to oversee, and the functionals are bringing their respective viewpoints. So one of the things that comes into play with that design and the development approach is where the team will work together, but again, the primary onus is on the chief or the leader to come up with the right approach. It depends on the type of system you're developing, but a good leader will really work hard to come up with an approach that makes sense for that particular project. The systems engineering process has a structured, systematic way of doing things, but every project is a little different. So while the process has clear steps that you follow to design and develop a system, you still need to think hard about what's the right approach for this particular project. If you're developing a large ship, you may need to take a certain tact that involves more time with drawings and models up front, and really doing some early crafting of certain pieces or certain technologies that are going to be involved. Or if you're designing something more straightforward, like this Humvee, let's say, that it doesn't have a lot of communications equipment on it, just needs to be armor hardened, you may not need as much exploration up front because the technology is available already. You just know you need to do some trades with weight and power and speed and performance. So that leader that chief engineer needs to be a real thought leader, like, and provide the team with the best approach that's going to, take the least amount of time and money and get them going in that design process so they can start to really pick it apart and get through some of those initial systems engineering steps. Those leadership and functional experts throughout the course of the design and development, their role is going to change a little bit. Early on, when they're first designing it, they're all going to be creative and they're all going to push to try to get good designs, good architectural drawings, good requirements. But once they agree and once they get to the point where they feel they're ready to start formally bending metal, fabricating, start actually building the parts, they have to move away from that mindset. They have to shift gears now to overseeing if either they're going to build or they're going to have someone else build the parts. So for example, if I was the architect, I'm a functional manager, I'm responsible for the architectural drawings, I'm working with the chief engineer, I'm working with other functionals, but I'm responsible for the architectural drawings. And I have a few different drawings that are my primary drawings. One is how the truck is physically going to be assembled, the different pieces, the drawings, like a blueprint. There is another set of drawings that show how the truck can withstand impact. So there's a series of technical drawings that show blast zones on the vehicle. If it gets hit here, it can handle this much pressure. So now, if you think about what I was saying a moment ago, where we're starting to build, let's say we had to hire a company to bring the chassis together and the different parts of the vehicle. I'm going to stay involved in the project because I know how it's supposed to come together because I did the drawings. But I'm not going to necessarily be the one that's directly bending metal and forming it and doing the physical construction of the pieces. But it's still very important that I stay involved as each piece comes to the table, comes to the factory floor, so that I can verify that it's correct to the specification or to the architectural drawings that I created. Now that'll be my responsibility. I'll be looking at the development of the system, the development of, let's stay with the truck example, the Humvee. I'll be responsible to make sure all the pieces are right individually, and then I can turn around and say to the chief engineer, from an architectural perspective, everything looks good. Or I can say, Chief, from an architectural perspective, I don't think that part of the Humvee is going to function properly. And he's going to rely on me to bring that type of knowledge and expertise forward, all the way through. And again, there's different functions that are going to have different responsibilities through the development. The chief engineer, in the same scenario we just went through, he's going to have to keep an oversight type of eye on the architectural aspects, but he's also going to have to worry about the other functionals, the other parts of the process where they're doing things related to locking down the design, and then also now they're shifting gears, and as things are being built, just like that architect had to shift his thinking to more of a verify and compliance type mindset, the other functionals have to as well. For example, there might be someone who, in the design process, worried about, again, testing, and he had to come up with a test plan. How are we going to test this once it gets assembled? He might have said, the test functional manager might have said, I want to test it when it's just like the chassis and the wheels. I want to run a test before we put anything on. And then he had to write this down in a document. Phase 1 of the test, I want the chassis and the basic armor on the bottom. Phase 2 is when they're going to put the rest of the shell of the vehicle together without any of the electronics components. I want to test the structural integrity of it. So he'll write that in the second phase section of his document. So he did that work during the design phase, and he got everyone to agree that that was a good plan for testing. And then as they went to building, now he's not the one building, so he's going to have to turn around now and change his perspective and look to validate, verify and validate that what is being produced is testing out, as we like to say, is testing out according to the plan that was agreed upon ahead of time. So you see how those roles, carry on throughout the life cycle, if you will, from the original interview with the stakeholder, with the customer, on what they wanted that Humvee to do, how fast it had to go. It had to be able to go into water so much. It had to be able to withstand explosives. All these details they had to worry about up front. And then 6 months later, or however fast they had to go, they switched gears, and now they're working with someone to build the pieces, and they're starting to verify and see it come together. They have to get this right. The chief engineer has to worry about the architects, the testers, the modelers, different functional roles, and ultimately that chief engineer is responsible. So those are some of the things in terms of the first couple things to understand about leadership and management responsibility. I have a couple things I'd like to show you before I get into the last question about how to kind of apply these type of systems engineering principles in your day-to-day experiences in high school. And the thing I'm going to push the envelope on is the leadership role, the chief engineer, because that's where I've been fortunate to spend the last handful of years of my career. I'm a 20-year systems engineer, and the first 3 quarters of that, the first 12 to 15 years of that, I was an expert in different functional areas. I was doing architectural drawings. I would help to write good requirements. The truck shall perform this fast and shall be able to turn corners at this speed. And I was good at writing them down and working with the community to make sure that they agreed that those were good requirements. I had roles like that. And what happens for a lot of systems engineers, depending on your personality and what your goals are, some people decided they want to really become an architect, architecture expert, world class. They want to go all the way and be able to model and architect the most complex systems, from spacecraft to rockets to systems that have different nodes, being able to express. I'll show you a drawing of that I pulled, that I reached back to some of my old experience. As a chief engineer now, you have to sometimes reach back and think, this project needs better architecture. And so I'll show you a drawing of that in a minute. But what happens for a lot of systems engineers when they work in these individual roles, at some point they reach a decision point in their career where, based on their performance and their ability to interact with people and also understand the technical content, they get asked to become a leader or a chief engineer of a project. And some are up for the task and some aren't. So let's talk a little bit more about what it means to be a leader on a systems engineering team, or a project where you got to build a product, and systems engineering methodology is being applied. That job is not only understanding the systems engineering process from beginning to end, and all those functional roles and all those detailed steps that you'll be learning about in the handbook, but it's also about working with people and being able to communicate effectively. And that has proven to be one of the biggest challenges that you can't necessarily read about in a textbook. You won't find a section in a lot of the systems engineering handbooks that talk about communication challenges associated with successful design and development of complex systems. But talk to any seasoned systems engineer, time and time again, you'll find that they faced a lot of the challenges were as a result of the lack of communications. In some of those scenario threads I was describing before, working with the stakeholders, a customer, to get the requirements right on how the Humvee needed to behave. Sometimes the chief engineer and some of the functionals assigned to him maybe don't get along. Lots of communication challenges. So one of the biggest things that I like to ensure is a key feature on any new project I get assigned to is that we take a close, careful look at the communications and making sure that I, number one, that I sense the current state of the project, and that I understand if there's any communication challenges, so that I can work on addressing those and getting those cleaned up. Because I know if we don't solve some communication challenges, the project is going to likely not succeed. And that's one important aspect of being a chief. Another one is being what I like to call a thought leader. And this one's even harder than communications, because on a lot of these complex systems, like these satellite communication systems that involve the design and development of the spacecraft, the design and development of the ground station that's got to communicate and take care of that spacecraft once it's launched, to users of the communication signal that they're coming off that satellite. Therein lies a lot of complexities that, yes, require good communications, but also require someone to constantly be pushing the envelope on when the team needs to try something a little differently. If you're back to that one analogy where I said the tester, maybe it was the chief engineer that said, in order for this Humvee to work, some of the things they're asking for have not been demonstrated in any vehicle prior. And so, you know what? I think the requirements are pretty good right now that we've written down, but I think some of these are risky because they've never been demonstrated in any vehicle before. How can this vehicle possibly float when it's going to have that much armor? They didn't ask for airtight requirements. And so, I think what we ought to do is kind of slow down right now and get some vehicles that come close and try to do some quick, rapid mock-ups on a full-scale vehicle, and let's take it out to a river, a lake, and let's try some crude testing. Let's just try to see how far we can push. And so if someone wasn't pushing that thought leadership, the team may have proceeded without that type of early exploration, and eventually they would have run into a lot of problems. They would have found out during formal testing, they would have gotten out there with the customer, and the customer would have driven it into the lake, to test it, and it would have taken on too much water. And the whole team would have lost, 6 months worth of work, and they would have had to go back and fix things.